In the final hours before dawn, Caracas feels suspended in time. The streets are empty, the air heavy, the city holding its breath. Inside government buildings, lights flicker and then disappear. Communication networks stutter, then fall quiet. Screens go dark. Systems that once hummed with routine authority stop responding, not because of failure, but because something has reached inside them and switched them off. At this moment, Venezuela's crisis stops being abstract. For years, the country's decline unfolded slowly, its currency hollowed out, its people leaving in waves, its economy shrinking under sanctions and mismanagement. Each stage felt survivable, even reversible. But this night is different. This is not erosion. It is exposure. What makes this moment dangerous is not what happens on the streets, but what happens beyond them. Decisions are being made far from Caracas by institutions, governments, and strategists who no longer see Venezuela as a domestic problem. They see it as a liability, a pressure point, a risk that cannot be left unattended. The country has crossed an invisible line. It is no longer treated as a sovereign crisis. It is treated as a strategic one. Nothing dramatic announces the shift. There are no sirens, no public statements, no formal declarations of intent. Yet the balance has already changed. From this point forward, the central question is no longer whether Venezuela will be transformed. That outcome is assumed. The real question is, who will control the direction of that transformation and at what cost? This moment matters because it strips away comforting explanations. It shows that Venezuela's fate is no longer driven only by ideology, leadership, or elections. It reveals why powerful nations cannot simply look away, why isolation is no longer an option, and why allowing Venezuela to drift has become unacceptable in a world shaped by energy, security, and influence. If you value history that explains how power really works beneath headlines and speeches, subscribe to The Hidden Chapter. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela appeared immune to the forces that destabilized much of Latin America. While neighboring states lurched between coups, dictatorships, and debt crises, Venezuela projected calm and continuity. It possessed something few others did: vast, easily accessible oil reserves at a time when industrial economies were hungry for energy. That single advantage reshaped how the country was perceived, both by its citizens and by the world. Oil revenue transformed Caracas into a modern capital. Highways stretched across the landscape, universities expanded, and a visible middle class emerged. The bolivar was once one of the strongest currencies in the region. Elections were held regularly, governments changed without tanks in the streets, and Venezuela earned a reputation as a stable democracy in an unstable neighborhood. To foreign observers, it looked like proof that natural wealth could anchor political order. This prosperity shaped political behavior. Because the state did not rely heavily on taxing its citizens, it faced less pressure to govern efficiently. Oil income paid for subsidies, public jobs, and social peace. Problems could be postponed rather than solved. Structural reform felt unnecessary when export earnings kept rising. Institutions grew dependent on cash flows rather than competence. Internationally, Venezuela's position seemed secure. It was a reliable supplier to the United States, a founding member of OPEC, and a diplomatic voice that mattered in global energy markets. As long as oil moved and dollars returned, Venezuela appeared indispensable. But this strength was narrow. Nearly everything depended on a single commodity. Economic diversification stalled, political incentives warped. Leaders learned that controlling oil revenue mattered more than building resilient systems. The appearance of power masked a dangerous reality: prosperity without flexibility, wealth without buffers, and influence tied to conditions beyond national control. When oil prices were high, these weaknesses remained hidden. When conditions changed, they would surface all at once. For decades, Venezuela stood out as an exception in Latin America. While coups and financial collapses swept through the region, Venezuela appeared stable, wealthy, and confident. The reason was oil. Beneath its soil lay some of the largest proven petroleum reserves on Earth. And during much of the 20th century, that resource insulated the country from pressures that broke others. Oil money reshaped the state. Governments could spend without taxing heavily. Subsidies kept fuel, food, and transport cheap. Public employment expanded, infrastructure projects multiplied, and the capital grew into a modern city of highways, towers, and ministries. The bolivar was strong enough to be trusted abroad. For ordinary citizens, stability felt permanent. For elites, oil revenues felt endless. Politically, Venezuela cultivated the image of a functioning democracy. Power transferred through elections rather than barracks. This gave the system legitimacy at home and credibility abroad. Compared to military regimes elsewhere, Venezuela looked like proof that natural wealth could coexist with democratic rule. Internationally, the country mattered. It supplied oil to the United States, helped shape OPEC policy, and held diplomatic influence far beyond its population size. As long as tankers left its ports, Venezuela was treated as a strategic partner rather than a fragile state. Foreign capital flowed in, confidence reinforced itself. Yet beneath this surface lay a structural weakness. Almost the entire economy revolved around oil exports. Manufacturing, agriculture, and productivity stagnated. Institutions grew dependent on revenue rather than accountability. Political competition shifted from managing the economy to controlling access to oil income. As long as prices remained high, the system held. Growth covered inefficiency. Spending replaced reform. But this apparent strength rested on conditions Venezuela did not control. The power it displayed was real, but it was narrow. And when the foundation shifted, the illusion would collapse with remarkable speed. As the pressure mounted and internal options disappeared, Venezuela turned to the outside world for relief. Cut off from Western credit markets, isolated by sanctions, and unable to refinance its debts, the government had few choices left. Survival required external lifelines, and those lifelines came from states willing to challenge U.S. influence: Russia, China, and a small circle of political allies. At first, the assistance looked like rescue. Chinese banks extended massive loans backed by future oil deliveries. Russian energy companies provided capital, technical support, and diplomatic cover. Political backing at international forums helped Caracas resist isolation. These arrangements kept fuel flowing, paid government salaries, and delayed outright collapse. To many inside the regime, they appeared to prove that Venezuela could survive without Washington. But this help was never free. Each loan was secured, not by reform, but by resources. Oil shipments were locked in years ahead at fixed terms, limiting Venezuela's ability to sell freely on global markets. Revenue that could have funded recovery was already spoken for. Strategic assets were open to foreign control, from oil fields to mining concessions. What looked like partnership was, in practice, dependency. The shift in power was subtle. There were no foreign troops on Venezuelan soil, no formal loss of sovereignty. Instead, influence moved quietly through contracts, repayment schedules, and supply obligations. Decisions that once belonged to Caracas were now constrained by creditors in Beijing and Moscow. Economic policy became less about national recovery and more about servicing agreements made under pressure. These deals narrowed Venezuela's future options. They stabilized the present by locking the country into long-term commitments that could not easily be reversed. Any attempt at reform risked default. Any change in leadership inherited the same obligations. This was finance used as leverage. Not charity, not ideology, but strategy. The lifelines that kept Venezuela alive also ensured it could not escape on its own terms. The turning point came not with invasion or collapse, but with a deliberate choice made at the height of apparent strength. Under Hugo Chavez and later intensified by Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela chose to reorganize its entire economic system around political control. What had once been a national resource became an instrument of power. Oil revenues were no longer treated as capital to be preserved and reinvested. They were redirected to secure loyalty, fund ideology, and project influence abroad. The state oil company, once a professional and technically respected institution, was reshaped into a political machine. Experienced engineers and managers were dismissed. Positions were filled based on allegiance rather than competence. Production targets were ignored. Maintenance was postponed. The system continued to function, but only because oil prices were high enough to hide the damage. This strategy delivered immediate results. Social programs expanded. Political opposition weakened. Regional allies were rewarded with subsidized energy. For a time, the leadership appeared unchallenged, but the relief was temporary and the cost was permanent. When global oil prices collapsed after 2014, the illusion shattered. The revenue that sustained the system vanished almost overnight. With reserves depleted and institutions hollowed out, there were no buffers left. Currency controls tightened, debt obligations were abandoned, money was printed to cover deficits, destroying the value of the currency. Each emergency measure deepened the crisis it was meant to solve. The leadership believed defiance would protect sovereignty. They assumed endurance would force concessions from rivals. Instead, resistance hardened isolation and closed remaining escape routes. Foreign investment disappeared. Trade relationships narrowed, economic flexibility vanished, short-term political survival was achieved, long-term national capacity was sacrificed. From that moment forward, recovery required choices the system could no longer make. This was the point of no return, when preserving power took precedence over preserving the foundations of the state itself. For a brief period, the regime's survival was mistaken for success. Against predictions of imminent collapse, the state remained standing. Sanctions failed to produce immediate political change. Protests were contained. Power stayed concentrated at the top. From a distance, this endurance looked like victory. New channels replaced old ones. When formal trade routes closed, informal networks expanded. Gold from illegal mining operations moved through shadow markets. Oil was sold at deep discounts through intermediaries willing to bypass restrictions. Cryptocurrencies and barter arrangements helped move value without passing through traditional financial systems. The government adapted not to rebuild the economy, but to keep the machinery of control running. To loyalists, this was proof that the country could resist external pressure. To rivals, it was evidence that sanctions were ineffective. But beneath the surface, the foundations of the state were eroding at a dangerous pace. Infrastructure continued to decay. Power grids failed. Refineries rusted. Water systems collapsed. Hospitals functioned without supplies. Schools emptied as teachers fled or abandoned their posts. Oil production, once the backbone of the economy, fell to levels not seen in generations. The country survived, but it no longer produced. Millions of citizens made the same calculation. Survival at home meant hunger, insecurity, and stagnation. Leaving meant uncertainty, but also possibility. The largest migration crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere unfolded quietly, one family at a time. What appeared to be stability was enforced paralysis. Order was maintained through fear, rationing, and dependency. The state still issued commands, but it could no longer provide opportunity. Time was being purchased through control, not progress. This phase delayed collapse, but it did not reverse it. The costs were accumulating invisibly, human capital lost, institutions hollowed out, trust destroyed. The system endured, but only by shrinking. What looked like resilience was, in reality, a slow and managed decline. Eventually, the consequences of collapse moved beyond Venezuela's borders. What had begun as an internal economic breakdown became a regional strain that no neighboring country could ignore. Each year, the pressure widened, spreading outward through migration, crime, and instability. Millions of Venezuelans crossed into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and beyond. Border towns doubled in size almost overnight. Schools, hospitals, and labor markets in neighboring states struggled to absorb the influx. Governments that had no role in Venezuela's internal decisions now bore the cost of its failure. What was once a domestic crisis turned into the largest displacement of people in modern Latin American history. At the same time, criminal networks expanded into the vacuum left by a weakened state. Smuggling routes multiplied, drug trafficking corridors shifted. Armed groups used Venezuelan territory as safe haven and transit zone. Gold mining in remote regions fueled corruption and environmental destruction while funding illicit economies that ignored borders entirely. Energy markets adjusted as well. Venezuela's collapse removed a major oil supplier from global circulation. Refineries reconfigured, shipping routes changed. Other producers filled the gap, while Venezuela's vast reserves remained trapped underground, inaccessible, and mismanaged. For the United States, the issue was no longer ideological or symbolic. It became strategic. A failed oil state with hostile alliances, criminal networks, and mass migration sat uncomfortably close to American shores. Sanctions had weakened the regime but had not changed its behavior. Diplomatic efforts stalled. Containment produced stagnation, not resolution. Over time, options narrowed. Every year of inaction raised the eventual cost of response. What followed was not a sudden turn toward confrontation, but the slow realization that delay itself was shaping the outcome. The crisis was no longer Venezuela's alone. It had become a shared problem, with shared risks and consequences that could no longer be confined. In the end, the greatest winners were not individual governments or leaders, but the systems that thrive on imbalance. Venezuela's collapse revealed how modern power operates when finance, energy, and geopolitics intersect. Control was not asserted through occupation or formal rule. It emerged through access, leverage, and timing. As Venezuela's oil production fell apart, global energy markets adapted with cold efficiency. Other producers filled the supply gaps. Shipping routes shifted. Prices adjusted. The world moved on, even as one of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth sat idle. Scarcity did not create urgency to rebuild Venezuela. It created opportunity elsewhere. Energy security became less about restoring failed states and more about managing alternatives. Strategic rivals also learned from the crisis. Russia and China tested the limits of influence through loans, infrastructure deals, and diplomatic cover. Their support was not designed to stabilize Venezuela's economy or society, but to secure leverage in the Western Hemisphere. These relationships deepened dependency without solving collapse. Venezuela remained weak but no longer isolated. For global financial systems, the lesson was even clearer. Debt, sanctions, and access to markets proved more powerful than military force. A nation could be constrained, reshaped, and pressured without a single border crossing. Sovereignty, once defined by territory, was now defined by liquidity, credit, and trade access. Venezuela's story is not only about ideology or leadership failure, it is about how resource wealth, when mismanaged, attracts influence rather than independence. Oil promised sovereignty. Instead, it magnified vulnerability. This collapse reshaped how policymakers understand power in the modern era. What truly matters is not who governs, but who controls flows of energy, capital, and legitimacy. In global politics, the most dangerous position is not being weak, it is being rich, unstable, and unable to stand alone.